How I Got Here, the inside stories of startups and innovation in travel and transportation, with your hosts, PhocusWire's Kevin May and Mozio's David Litwak. Hello, everyone, and welcome to How I Got Here, Mozio and PhocusWire's podcast that delves into the innovators in travel and transportation. Today, we're joined by Brad Bao, one of the two founders of Lime. Lime was founded in January 2017 by Brad and Toby Sun, and is primarily known for popularizing the dockless scooters you see around every city these days. But they're also known for operating electric bikes, normal pedal bikes, and even car sharing systems. So thank you for joining us today, Brad.
Thank you for having me here, and I'm very glad thanks again for you guys to create this awesome venue for us to, really discuss the industries and also innovations everyone has.
Of course, it's been an absolute pleasure so far. So as you know, we like to start every one of these podcasts off the same way, which is for us to ask you how you got here.
Yeah, love the question. I think I heard a lot of a big fan of the series. Heard great stories out of it as well. So I'm more than happy to share mine. I'd like to begin with that the creation or the genesis of Lime probably is a little bit different from many other startups, right? We didn't got hit by the lightning. We didn't say, hey, here's a brilliant idea, let's just create it tomorrow. But I do think the Lime creation was a result of a combination of passion, which is about travels and bikes itself, right? That's one thing. Frustration with the incumbents or the existing solutions, and very deep research, and also entrepreneurship. That's actually at the end of it. So we started Lime in 2017, but we actually started work way before that. And before we, Toby and I started Lime, we were at a venture fund that I co-founded back in 2013, and we're doing a bunch of researches and doing venture investments across the globe. And one sector that always we are passionate about is travel and the transportation. It's just given the nature that that we just love it, right? We travel a lot, and I'm a pretty avid global traveler as well. And B, that I'm a cyclist, and it's hard to tell with the outfits or not, but I just love it. We grew up in China, moving in the US in our adulthood. Back then, bike was the way we traveled. Ever since elementary school, that I think it's kind of unthinkable in some other countries. But back in the elementary schools, I bike by myself to school, and in the university, I bike roughly about 20 miles per trip, right, one way to my college, and that's my main way of transportation. So I think the diversity of the backgrounds that give everyone a little bit different kind of a perspective on the world, that some of that is, for example, in the US, that bikes are more seen as a sports than transportation, while as to me, bike is the main way of transporting, myself and hang out with friends. But then Europe is kind of in the middle, right? It's well accepted as a way of transportation, but meanwhile, it's a really good sports as well. So when I came to the US, I converted my biking habit into more sports, but always questioned that, why this is not widely adopted. So when we were doing the research on shared mobility, Uber, everything else, right? The market was booming at the time. If you think about back in the 2015, 2016 era, but also meanwhile that we still found it's clumsy and also stuck in the traffic and all that when we in the urban setting. Everyone that if we ask the audience, right, to raise their hand, have you ever get frustrated when you're stuck in the traffic in a urban environment? Have you ever encountered a situation that you want to go to a destination, but then you figure that you were stuck in the taxi or the Uber or buses and waited that you could have already walked over or biked over? I think everyone had that moment, right? That frustration started to build up, and when we were, a little bit story there that we were running late for between the meetings, in New York, actually. The meeting was scheduled really tight. We thought we had enough time, and there was bad traffic, right? And then we went to the system called a City Bike. Then what I realized is set up the account to get a bike taking me 15 to 20 minutes. And then when I go to the first station, there's no bike. And then we had to dash to the second station. We eventually find a bike, spend it 15, 20 minutes, get a bike, and bike to the other place near, not quite, but near to our destination. And the dock was full. We cannot return the bike. So we were late to the meeting. We spent a lot of time setting up the account. And then we had to leave the bike out of the dock. And the next day, we were fined $49 because we didn't return to the dock, which was not my problem, right? And combine that with the passion of environmental protection, which we all agree that urbanization is faster and faster, city gets more crowded, which we should also all agree that pollution in the city is much worse than before. But there's no solution, right? Adding more highways or that, it just doesn't help. So we looked at bikes as a way to solve all the problems. And when we look at the industry, why we had got to ask ourselves a few questions, and that's our roughly about 6 to 8 months of dedicated research was on. Number one, does that in the long term help consumers, cities, communities when real estate in the city, namely shared real estates like public roads and all that stuff, is getting more crowded and more scarce? The answer is yes. Do users adopt this kind of form of transportation? Does it save their money? Does this save them time? Do we have any validations? So we look around and cities like Amsterdam or Copenhagen, that 50% of the traffic already are on non-cars. And that's a strong validation that it could be done, right? Some will ask, oh, in the US, or some other cities, it's cold, it rains, and all that stuff. Look at Amsterdam, look at Copenhagen. I don't think New York is any colder than that. And then we look at a more well-established bike system. For example, one of them was the bronze bike in London. The adoption rate and the utilization actually was quite high. Then we further look at a city bike, with all the limitations of that, do people use it? And what we find out is it actually was highly leveraged and used during the summertime, not as much in the winter. But the problem was that is in conclusion, all the system today was incomprehensible in order to provide a reliable service to the users. But users do love it, users do use it. And the last question we have to answer is why all the systems are not addressing this kind of a challenge in the past. Any limitations, any drawbacks? Does the business model work? In order to be a sustainable business, to provide a long-term value, right, the business model has to work. So that all come back together to us, and we're trying to answer those questions, and the picture becomes more clear and clear. First is the first principle of a transportation service is it needs to be comprehensive in order for the user to use. It cannot just only be available, but it has to be readily anytime, anywhere user need it. Second, it has to be economically cheap enough for user to use it as a daily method, not just occasionally used as a leisure ride. And the third thing is the whole system needs to be so easy to use and very easy to adopt instead of spending 15, 20 minutes when you're in a rush and trying to figure it out. So all these things come together. I think we have a good way to address the challenge in terms of urban mobility. And as a reminder, the urban mobility, majority of the trips are short. More than 40%, depends on the city, 40, 50% of the trips are less than 2 miles. So if you apply that into the current solutions, right, waiting for a bus to ride for a mile or two, on average, take you 10, 15 minutes of wait, and it doesn't take you to destination. Waiting for taxi and Uber roughly take maybe 5 to 10 minutes. And that adds up in terms of the most valuable thing to all of us is time. It just doesn't worth it. And in terms of the cost, Uber taxi and everything, it just out of the reach for, I don't have a figure, but majority of the people on a daily basis, right? Occasionally, of course, we all use it, but on a daily basis, it's economically not enough to be a daily use. Then the last question we got to answer is, why it didn't work in the past. And what we found out are, one, the product and the hardwares are outdated. They were created a decade or even longer ago. At the time, GPS was astonishingly expensive, right? The data connection was very expensive. They were all created based on docks, which limited the availability of the service and also limit the utility of it. It doesn't get you to where you want to go, right? So that's one thing. And the second thing was the way it was sponsored in the past, or the business model was based on city grants or the federal grants, which limits the availability and also limits the innovations that goes into it. So based on the first principle of like, let's go back on what the user want instead of what's available. The user want a cheap alternative, get them there faster, and also is economic, friendly. And also one very important aspect I want to point out is it has to take less real estate or space on the ground. And if we compare, the available solutions today, a bike takes roughly about 1/10 of the real estate compared to a car. It consumes roughly 1/80 of energy, or there's no pollution related to this. The cost is 1/3 or even lower compared to a car trip. And it does need to be, from A to B directly, which is the dockless that we, kind of insist on. And in addition to that, the relationship with cities and community is the last question we need to answer. We had too many stories of like, hey, let's just crash into that and then we negotiate, terms later or whatnot. We decided not to do it. I think we figured our customers, if you would, right, it's not only just the end users who benefit from the services, but also the community and cities and how we can help them reduce traffic and pollution. So we always insisted that we get a license and permit and working with the cities to establish the products. So what we did in 2017, that we redesigned the entire hardware, redesigned the entire operating system, and we redefined how a private company can work with cities and government to provide a service to the general public. So that's how we Lime come to life.
Very cool. So many questions. Ironically, one of the ones I had written down before we jumped on this was about the idea of like asking for forgiveness later, and you kind of addressed that a little bit, but we can get back to that in a second. I wanted to ask one quick follow-up question here. You guys had a few, I don't want to say a few iterations, but you guys were once called Lime Bike, and now it's mostly Lime, right? Because there's not as many bikes, maybe. I feel like you were known for different things at different points, and it seemed like when the scooters were introduced, that's kind of when at least you guys took off, at least in the public psyche. So can you maybe elaborate on maybe just that small part of your guys' launch, how you went from bikes to scooters and more?
Yeah, totally. So when again that back to the story that when we launched the company, or when we started the company, we already had the roadmap. If you ever came across our like early, company presentations or pitch deck, that before we raised Series A, that the bikes, e-bikes, and all that stuff is already in the roadmap. And again, that I think transportation is not about just a product; it's a service. The service has one goal and one goal only, is to get a user from A to B, instead of say, hey, you have to use this method versus the other method. So anything that serves urban mobility was in our roadmap. And it has the shorter distance, which is a pedal bike, and then e-bike, which is a longer distance, and then all kinds of form of transportation. But we're iterating, we're testing, we're experimenting. Of course, I think is scooter the final form for the urban transportation? I don't believe so. I think it will further evolve over time, and I do believe that there will be not only one product, but rather a service platform to provide all of them. So that's how we get started. And we started with the company with the brand actually Lime. not a Lime bike, but the first product we launched was a Lime bike. And what we found was a search or discovery issue. When we launched with only Lime, you search in the App Store, what you found is like lime recipes, cocktails, and all that stuff. And that make the user really difficult, right? You're standing on the sidewalk, you look at a bike, you want trying to unlock it, and it says lime on it. So if you search at a time, say lime, then you find you will be frustrated, finding all the non-related, irrelevant stuff. And that's why we started with lime bike, and then converted back into Lime when we launched the third product. But the vision and our plan never changed. I think the goal, the vision, the mission never changed.
It's interesting.
Yeah, sorry, go ahead, Kevin.
No. I was just going to say, you're talking about, in the public consciousness. And I remember being in Berlin, I can't remember what year it was, for the ITB exhibition, which is the big trade show every March. And didn't notice anything then. And then I was in Berlin about 3 or 4 months later for a weekend with some friends. And I don't know if it was the weather or you just launched, but they were everywhere. I mean, honestly, you couldn't walk down a street in Berlin without seeing someone whizzing around on the scooters. I mean, it was really interesting to go. It was just a 3 or 4 month period, and it was everyone was saying, "Have you got the Lime app? Have you tried the scooters yet?" And we all had to go, obviously. But anyway, that's an aside. I'm interested because I wonder how you went about your kind of demographic analysis, and how did you try and understand who was going to actually be a user? Because I would, I don't live in London, but I lived in London for 20 years, and I used to ride my push bike or get the subway or the underground, and I would use a Lime bike if I wanted to, because I'm fairly fit. I like riding, I like cycling my bike and stuff like that. So how did you? But that's not for everybody. Not everyone wants to ride in the rain in their kind of work clothes or whatever. So how did you go about trying to estimate what your kind of audience size was likely to be?
Yeah, I think that's a really great question. So first of all, let me add a little bit of color to the exploration, right? We have a Lime lab, and we have all kinds of transportation things in there. The one-wheelers, the two-wheelers, the wheels you mount on your shoes, and the tricycles, the all kinds of crazy things that you could imagine. And we test all of them. And when we concluded, number one thing for a good product is safety. The safety is not only the real safety that it poses to the users, but also sense of safety, feeling in control, feeling secured, and feeling comfortable using it even occasionally. I think the biking population, for example, in the US, there are roughly about 1% of people, including myself, right, bike to work, bike to groceries, all that stuff, or the 99% that they are relatively new to this. Many of them are using it as sports in parks and on trails, but not in a city urban environment. So when we gradually launch in different products, we actually launched the bikes in roughly July in 2017, and the e-bikes in September. So roughly every 6 months, we launch a new product. And when we launch the scooters, what happens is, given the low central gravity and given the no requirements of physical activities, that becomes instant popular. And there's also a little bit hint of being cool, right? The bike kind of is a little bit old school. This is the cool thing and all that. And that's where we find out. So we didn't start to say we are going to design it for younger generations or more mature generations or whatnot. But we actually started more fundamentally is what it takes for urban mobility in a small form factor becomes popular. I think the sense of safety, easy access, and also less requirements on the physical stress are the important things.
Just a quick follow-up on that, if I may, Brad. I mean, I as a regular cyclist in London, when I used to commute there, when I lived there, you know, people would say to me, how do you get to work? And I'd say, oh, I ride my bike. And they go, you're absolutely insane. I'd never ride a bike in London. It's absolutely crazy. The drivers are crazy. You've got the tourists walking out in the middle of the street all the time, all this kind of stuff. So was there a bit of educating as part of your kind of initial marketing to say,
That's right.
oh, actually, it's quite safe. You know, it's you know, because people always say it's not about you, the rider, it's everybody else. So, you know, how did you convince people that it was actually a safe mode of transport if they hadn't used a bike or a scooter before?
Yeah, I think that's one of the biggest thing that the Lime wanted to accomplish.
Yeah.
It's actually not just provide a product service, but generate this movement, the movement of onto, really two key things. One key thing is what exactly you ask is how we not just promoting safe, but also educate the public. And the public means the riders and non-riders, right? All together and work with city to improve it. So when we look at back on some of the histories and some of the data, number one thing is the bike incidence rate is actually quite low. And given the speed, given the mass, mass in terms of the weight of the vehicle, even there was an accident, it's not as severe. The most of the accident happens is car to cars when you have a 4,000-pound vehicle crash into another vehicle or another person or not. It's the most devastating state. But as bikers, I think everyone, when we learn it, we all fall, right? You got a bruise or whatnot, but it's actually quite safe. The data has been validated by, many of the DOT, or DOT means Department of Transportation, many of the research institutions. Second thing, when we look at penetration rate matters a ton. The lowest incident rate in terms of traffic or bike incidents is in Copenhagen and Amsterdam. And that part, if you look at it, right, they don't even wear helmets.
I know.
Not against it. I still promote and heavily, wanted to incentivize users to wear helmets. But I think that explains something. And the most incident happens is when there's not enough critical mass, the car drivers are not paying enough attention to it. And that's one of the biggest things. And there is a research by, I believe what was done by Oxford. And what they found correlation, the highest correlation of incidents and regulation is actually helmet law. Anywhere requires helmet as a law, discourage people riding on the road. And in turn, discourage the city to build more infrastructure. And then in turn, let the drivers to pay less attention to it, right? As biker, you probably also heard a term is called, I think it's called Copenhagen door open. So you open the door not with your, left hand. What we were driving on with the driver's seat on the left, right? You open the door handle with your right hand, and naturally that you will turn and look behind you before you open the door, right? So that never gets popular in other cities. Guess why? Because people doesn't need to pay as much attention if there's no critical mass. So I think that a few things is educate the users that by statistic, what is the incident rate and how severe they are. Number two is promote what is the safe practice, which we spend a lot of time on and a lot of energy and resource, and we give hundreds of thousands of helmets for free, and we create first ride campaigns all over the place, right? Germany, London, all over the place. The last thing is to provide the data to the city and help them to build infrastructure. Some of the examples are after we launch Seattle, Oregon, Portland, and even Paris that started building more bike lane, protected bike lane. That's the number one measurement to promote safe rides in the city, and it benefits everyone.
Yeah. Just last one from me. I mean, this is more of a practical question about the mechanics of the business, really. I mean, it's a great idea. You will have come up with the idea and you've thought about the hardware and the software and everything that's needed. To go from the idea to having, as you said, you don't want people to have a poor experience of not being able to find one of your bikes anywhere. How did you go through the process of figuring out how many bikes you needed to produce in the first city so that you got a sense of some kind of critical mass that people were able to find a bike as and when they needed one?
Yeah, uh, I think what we've done are really in twofold. Twofolds. The first thing is we will study the city first, and we'll come up with a proposal. And this actually has been now we're leading the trend, and it becomes a more industry standard in a way, right? Let's just say, for example, we are in discussion with London. So we will go to London and say, here, why don't we, if we're uncomfortable to launch a citywide, let's launch a district, let's launch a borough. And for that part, it says micromobility is all covering, we're hyper-local business, right? We're covering a mile, 2 mile of radius. It doesn't need to be entire London. We can start with a borough or two, and then we look at like how many streets on it, how many street corners. Yeah, this is very interesting. The corner matters a ton in terms of like the routing, in terms of local businesses, communities, and in terms of potential risk points, for incidents or not, right? And population, movement of people, and then we'll submit a proposal to the city. So here's our proposal, here's the data, here's the stats, here's what we learned from other cities. In a comparable city, we tested, and this is how many you probably needed. But, if we are not going to launch a city with 20 bikes, that's more for the show, not really for the people, for the real use. We're not going, however, to launch a city with 200,000 bikes. That's probably too much to begin with. And the adoption curve, there is always adoption curve, right? We started with the approximately right amount to start with, enough density for the user to use it when they need it, but also taking into account how we can manage it, how we can service it, how we can make sure they're safe, and how we fitting the adoption curve. And the second thing we do, this is the beauty of being dockless service provider, then the data will tell us how many pickups here, how many missing demands here, how many bikes has been, or scooters has been sitting there for 24 hours without use, and there's no demand. And that data will then help us to optimize our algorithm and where we deploy, how many we deploy, any bike or scooters are not be used, and we should move out of that place. And that will give us really the perfect number and the perfect method to determine not only how many we need them, but where we need them and what time. And this is one of the secret sauce that Lime has spent a lot of resources to develop.
Okay. No, it's fascinating, David.
Yeah, Brad. So you said something a few minutes ago about you wanted to start a movement, and I thought that was actually really interesting because I'll be the first to admit when I first saw some of the scooters around, I didn't. My first thought wasn't that they were cool. It was like, oh, that's kind of dorky a little bit, I'll be honest. And I think the reason is because Razor, like they look to remind people of Razor scooters that we had growing up, right when we were little, and I think though that like I use them all the time. I live in New York City, so not when I'm here, but I live part-time in DC, and they're all around DC, and they're obviously so convenient. And I feel like you did have to change hearts and minds, and I wonder how much of it was the, how much of it was just like people adopting a new way of doing things, and how much of it was the business model. Because I remember I lived in SF for 7 years, and there was Scoot, and Scoot never really took off, and I think they kind of sold in a fire sale, if I'm not mistaken, to Bird. And they weren't clearly the model, but they were like maybe potentially the coolest scooters, or more like Vespas, right? But they just didn't seem to nail the business model right. How did you balance getting the right product with the right level of cool factor to start a movement like that? And how do you think about that?
Yeah, it's we study as part of the research, as I mentioned, right? We studied city bikes, borough bikes, and the Scoot and many other companies at the time to figure why they got some success and why they're not taking off at the time. I think for a form factor like Scoot, it's just a little bit too intimidating. It's big, you sit really high, your central gravity is high, and also it looks more like a motorcycle, which is associated with high speed, associated with incident rates. I tried it. I actually think it's quite safe, but I think the adoption will be relatively low in terms of like the user, again, back to what I mentioned, right? The sense of being safe is not there. And the second part, I think given they were trying to do is more, in a way, station-based. They're kind of like, not really station-based, but at the end of the day, you're looking at big vehicles, you need to find real estate, so you end up they're in corrals instead of like, being convenient. So I think that take away some of the utility, right? There's the emotional part of it, there's the utility part of it. When we were trying to, think about the products, right, we did start from two extreme ends. One extreme end is the old school commuter bike. And we have a bunch of them. We were one of the largest operator in the world in terms of that, but adding the GPS trackings, adding, extra safeties and whatnot. And then the extremely, let's just say, cool with a lot of cool factor kind of product, and trying to find where that middle is. So electric scooter is actually relatively new. I'm not sure you guys know the history of it. It only gets popular not long ago. The scooter was by itself as a category was created less than 20 years ago. And then the electric scooter really gets some traction no more than like 8 years ago, or even 5. That before that it was a really, really niche market. I would guess we didn't have the scientific data, but I would guess 90% of our users, or if not more, never tried an electric scooter before Lime. It's their first try. It's really the first time that they adopted, and it does feel a little bit dorky. It does feels like, oh, that's the whatever kid down the block, right? That kind of thing. But today you're seeing the users are from like 18 years old to 80 years old. The highest age I know of was 92, was on our scooter. So I think that's really the movement coming. I think the movement comes into first is recognize and agree upon the value of reduced traffic and pollution, and feeling that I'm contributing to it, right? And then the second part is that it becomes a new trend that this is actually something cool. Examples of that happens in the past a lot, right? We used to use plastic bagging to shoppings, all that stuff, and then because of the consciousness of environmental protection, we're using paper bags and all that. And that seems like a small shift. But in the beginning, people was whining about, wow, this thing leak, this thing got soaking water, it breaks. I just cannot use it. It looks like so cheap. But now it's a normal thing. So I think our goal is to make urban transportation, on a shared platform, actually not cool. Actually, is you see it as a normal part of your life, and that's our goal. But it started with the movement of people recognizing it, agree with the values, and feeling contribute to it, and that's the beginning part. So I think the journey of like reinvent urbanization, the urban mobility is just at the beginning.
I love that. It's you guys. Your goal was basically to commoditize and normalize, not to maybe set it up as something cool. And I actually think that's a really good distinction. If to the kind of way of thinking about it. I wanted to ask you. So what's interesting is I think the first way bike share and scooter share maybe burst into the public psyche was in China, right? Mobike and all these other guys that I don't actually know the full state of many of them, but I know a lot of them are bankrupt, if I'm not mistaken. And I know there are literally called bike graveyards of orange and yellow bikes piled up in different cities in China. And so actually, I think this is kind of like a two-part question here, in that, one, part of the reason that was the case is that there weren't a lot of competitive moats or barriers for those companies in particular. At least not enough to stop Alibaba and Tencent going at each other with a bike proxy war. But that's part of a wider question of why did you choose America? Because I remember I studied abroad in France, in Paris in 2008, I think, 2007, and they already had Velib. They had a culture of bike sharing, in 2007, and I feel like a trend that we see a lot in this podcast. We asked the BlaBlaCar founder this as well, is like, why didn't carpooling work in America? And he said, that's an America specific thing, and it's sometimes the behavioral patterns really matter in a country. So I actually found it a little surprising that you guys, especially with your Chinese background and the population of bikes in China, that you chose America. So I think there's got to be some insights there.
Yeah, I think the great question. Thanks for that. Let me answer it in two parts as well, right? The first part, in terms of the business models or that, and during our research, I look back to the histories and with the focus on two things. Do user use it, right? If user don't want it, no one's gonna shuffle a new product or service down their throat. And the second part is there a business model to be built to provide a service and also create a sustainable business? And why it's not working in the past? So the first bike share, to be clear, the first dockless bike share, not even docked, was created in 1942 in Amsterdam. It's called a white bike. If you search on online and look for white bike, it's still there. And it started with exactly the same idea, with exactly the same vision, to using shared bikes and devices like this to ease the urban transportation. And starting with the idea, however, at the time was based on is honor based. So a bunch of people, donate their bikes. They're painted all white, entirely white, so very distinguished. And they put on the street. Everyone can borrow it. When you use it, you put it back on the street. Brilliant idea, and that vision has never changed. It didn't work, and the reason being, I think there are many game theories goes into that, right? And the reason being, if there's not enough identity or security kind of measurements, guess where the bikes end up with? They're all gone, like literally in a relatively short time. So then what happens is that then it was created in the form of dock-based bike shares, and that's all over the places, and mostly funded by the government. Since everyone see the use of it, see the benefit of it, technology at the time, however, was incomprehensible. Without a GPS, without data link, right? They relies on the real estate to create docks, and they're super expensive. If the audience is interested, you can look into how much they cost. It's an astonishing number, right? I can literally tell you that to create a station and based bikes, the bike plus the service contract in 5 years will not cost more than my car. That's how much it cost, and it doesn't make sense anymore. So then move forward, I think the bike share in China, validated a few things. So number one thing they validated is user love it. Regardless, let's put the business aside. User loved it. They use it for convenience. They use it for saving time. They use it for reduced pollutions and whatnot, right? And also they're much less expensive than other alternatives. The second thing they validated is, in terms of the operating model, that with the current technology, it could be done. With GPS, with data behind it, with the algorithm that dynamically, balancing, rebalancing, or even fixing the bikes or the vehicles, it could be done. What they failed to do, and this is one of the reasons that leads us to believe that US and Europe are a better market, is this connection between the cost of the vehicle itself and the user's willingness to pay. So per trip, the bike share in China on average fetch roughly about 50 cents RMB, and that translates into roughly about 7 cents US dollars. In the US, I think $1 a trip for our bike share is pretty much a no-brainer, right? That this is probably the cheapest ever transportation you ever had in terms of like getting around on a bike. And scooter costs a little bit more, but still, it's the best alternative. Roughly about the same price or a little bit higher than a bus, without the weight, without the walk at the beginning or at the end. So in terms of the value, those are the cheapest way. But guess what $2 means compared to 7 cents per trip? You're looking at 30x in terms of revenue. But guess how much our bikes or scooters cost compared to their bikes? They're universal. A bike you're buying from the factories, for the China market or for the US market, they're roughly the same. It's more expensive, I can tell you that, since we have higher standard in terms of like, environmental friendly paint, better safety devices, more sturdy, bigger frames for the body builds here. But at the end of the day, you're not looking at 30x of cost. So that's one of the reasons we did it. And the second part is China has been well served in that regard. I'm not just saying the bike share. In terms of the urban transportation, Asia in general has more robust systems compared to US and Europe. How many bus lines are running in Beijing? The time when I had my startup over there, that was like 17 years ago, right? They have 200 bus lines. They have 7 major, subways, and then supplement with the small buses that's shared, and the tuk tuk, right? The tuk tuk little cars running around, taking around for 2 RMBs, and all kinds of things. Well, as in the US in particular, this market is very well underserved. And that's one of the reasons that we see the opportunity, but also see that as a mission for us to, really fill the gap.
I love that. It's funny. I talked about this years ago when we started Mozio, talking about the multimodal future. For the longest time in America, you had taxis and subway, and that's it. And there was
Yeah.
nothing kind of in between. And how basically you're seeing like a slicing and dicing of every single price point usage case now. And I think that's a great point that like a lot of Asian countries had multiple tiers existing already in between in a way that in America we didn't. I like your quip there about building for a bigger frame. Yes, Americans are fatter than than people in Asia. Yeah, I can imagine that there's a lot of interesting cultural changes. So I had one last more before I turn it back over to Kevin, which is we I feel like I watched the rise in Uber and Lyft in San Francisco and then the necessary clampdown afterwards. And I think they had an attitude, and I alluded to this earlier, of ask for forgiveness, not permission. And, flouting a lot of local city and state laws. And I think you could say by a lot of standards, they got away with it. Now, obviously in California, there's a bill that potentially could screw them. And so your strategy might be vindicated, right? I think a lot of people felt, who were industry observers, that the scooter industry paid the price for their recklessness, that you guys ended up with extra regulations, extra RFPs, and more. That was basically a reaction to, we let Uber and Lyft run wild. We're not going to do that again with these scooters everywhere. Um, I'm curious how much of your strategy to engage with cities was based on just that new reality versus did you actually think that what Uber and Lyft did wasn't a smart idea in the first place?
Yeah, I think there might be nuances, for different segments or that. And for us, it was very clear ever since the day one that we determined that we're going to work with city, not using the old strategy. And I'll explain a little bit better that the thinking process, behind it. And the second thing, we were begging for regulations. Again, I think the main reason, I would say 3, right? First, for the Uber Lyft versus like the micro mobility is entirely different, since they have very strong incumbents, like taxi unions or whatnot, right? The incumbents would not allow any regulation would pass, right? They were startup at the time. They don't have millions or hundreds of millions in revenue and tens of millions in lobby cost, right? That's my guess, right? But I think that's one of the thinking process in there. Well, as for us, who are we up against? There's no such a system that is powerful or has the that strong
No scooter
incentive to
lobby, big scooter.
yeah, blocking us. Well, right, and then I think that's one of the key differences in terms of just a business logic. We don't go against anyone. We're not up against like taxi unions as Uber Lyft did. We're not up against like hotel chains as Airbnb did. We are providing a service. But the most important thing, however, for us is, as I briefly mentioned earlier, is we've determined that our customers is not only just users. We have 3 groups of customers. We have the users that are all riders, and then we have the communities we're serving. We are in their community, on their blogs, on the street. So we pay a lot of attention to the non-riders. How do we make sure they're not, cluttered, block the sidewalks? How do we even have a technology called a sidewalk detection, right? Sidewalk riding detection, all that stuff, to protect and help the community. And the other one is the city. Again, back to the vision and also, what we want to achieve. We want to achieve our 2 things, right? The movement, everyone participate. even they don't ride, they can be part of the movement and supporting it, supporting all the change. And city is critical in there. And the second thing is to reinvent urban mobility, and that we cannot achieve it by ourselves. To be clear, infrastructure is with the cities, how they plan the bike lanes, do they have that is protected or not, right? And many things that goes with it. So they're our customer. You don't piss off your customer, go against them. You just never do that. And we see them as a customer, even they're not paying us revenues or that. We even, their cities come to us and willing to give us grants and subsidizes to create a program. And we'll say, look, here's the deal. We will not take the money. Instead, we'll give you the data. You can use it to build more bike lanes. Protected bike lanes, education, campaigns will work with you on those things. And that's the vision. So I think the fundamentally business logic, we don't have to, we don't need to, we don't want to do it, but also vision-wise, city are our customers, our partners, and we cannot achieve what we wanted to achieve without their help.
Yeah,
So,
it's funny. Oh,
sorry, go ahead, Dave.
Well, just one comment, and then I'll turn it over to Kevin. Actually, it's funny that I posted something on LinkedIn like 4 or 5 weeks ago when Uber bought a company called AutoCab or iGo, and it was kind of a funny full circle because I've been in the industry for 9 years, and for all 9 years up until about 6 weeks ago, Uber was talking about how they didn't want to work with anyone else, not working with anyone else at all. I was going to do it all by themselves, and I remember thinking like, you're $20-30 billion as a pittance in the $1 trillion transportation industry. You're going to need to work with everyone else, and I just made a joke that they went through like the 5 or 6 stages of transportation startup grief, which is thinking we're going to take over the world and ending with, okay, fine, we're more of a platform and we'll work with other people now. And like it seems like you guys started at phase 6, so congratulations on skipping through all the other arrogance.
I've just to kind of finish us off then. I mean, I don't want to add a kind of a negative tone to all this, because it's been a really almost kind of uplifting conversation, because it's a very positive kind of business. It's about sustainability and urban mobility and mobilizing communities and things. But I'm interested in a couple of things, and that's, how did you go about tackling things like theft of the bikes and vandalism, and more at a fundamental business level? I mean, maybe the report I've been reading earlier is wrong, but they were talking about big losses that you made last year. I mean, how have you approached kind of the sustainability of your own business as you've got through the last, certainly 2019 when you became the CEO, and this year? I mean, I think we can all discount any kind of business logic when it comes to 2020, but just talk us through the kind of your kind of own sustainable business model.
Yeah, totally. I think that's actually a very important, topic, and I'd love to share a little bit our journey with, with the industry. I think, first and foremost, right? Let me just make it very clear. In order to create a world-changing product or service, we have to have a sustainable business. Otherwise, it will not last. It will not achieve our vision and goals. So that has been the focus for the company. But first, go back to the first one though. There are a lot of story to share in terms of like the theft and all that stuff. The first of all, the data shows we have already operated hundreds of thousands of vehicles around the globe over like hundreds different cities on actually 5 out of the 7 continents. So that part, that the data actually shows very clearly the theft is very low, probably less than 1%. That's the number one thing I wanted to share. The second thing is, how initially we always have a little bit higher, but less theft, a little bit more vandalism. I think the vandalism came into 2 ways. One is trying to, steal the vehicles or bikes, and the second part is, again, back to the movement. Some people believe in it, some people don't. Right, they will do crazy things or whatnot. The technology helps us a ton, since every one of them are GPS tracked, and we have sensors, and it will trigger the alarm, and then we can take actions on it. And we know exactly where they are. Even you steal it, we literally saw vehicles was running on the freeway like 60 miles an hour, right? And you know what happens. And then all we do is just follow that trace and go there, knock on the door, say, hey, can you return our vehicles? And so, what vehicle? well, here's the GPS, here's exactly the location in your backyard, right? And then the second thing we'll tell them, which is very critical as well, because our vehicles are all specifically designed for a urban shared application. And what it means is it's not pleasant to use as a personal use, but the most important thing is there's no resale value. You can't
Yeah.
use it. You use it on the street, people will know what it is, and it's tracked by GPS. Without a charging infrastructure, they cannot recharge it. And the most important, if they take to, black markets or that, nobody's gonna buy it.
Right.
And what
Yeah,
happened,
good
I will
point.
share with you a really fun story. That initially we had a warehouse. I won't, name the city or not. It doesn't help in this context, right? So we had a warehouse. Our team are getting ready to launch the products, and it was in the backyard. So the second day when we get there, the bikes are gone, right? They were like taken out of the warehouses or that. What happened the third day is the most interesting thing, right? The third day we briefly saw some up on the Craigslist and immediately got deleted, probably by the owners. And the third day they were thrown back to our warehouse over the fence, because they figured out they cannot sell it, and it's like evidence of crime in their backyard. And that's what happens is they will throw back over the fence back into our warehouses. But I think these things, however, what I want to emphasize is very small. Percentage-wise, it's very small and it's very manageable. But I think most important thing again is that if it becomes a normal part of our life, if we all believe that's creating value not just for the riders but for everyone of us, then we will endorse it. We will help to protect it. We have community members actually patrol the street for us because they believe it's helping them to reduce traffic in that community, and believe this is the cheapest alternative, and that for them to get around, since they've been waiting for the bus line to extend or the subway line over there for over a decade, and nothing happened, right? And there's no way for them to get around, and they see this as a gift. So put that aside. So back at the second question, there are distinguished characteristics of what we do. And the most two important thing, number one is innovation. We've been iterating, improving, and all that, and it's very capital heavy in terms of doing iteration, doing the development and all that. And we're proud of the speed we achieved. In general, the hardware, if you ever encounter, the development cycle is somewhere between 2 to 3 years or 2 to 5 years. Well, as we be iterating our products and vehicles that on a quarterly basis. So that does generated quite a bit, let's just say, waste or necessary capital expenditure in the beginning part. When it stabilized, however, then we really benefit from the innovation we have. The second part is we are still a startup. As a reminder, we're less than 4 years old. We're 3 years old company. We're learning how to operate, how to design hardware products, how to operate it, how we optimizing our algorithms and all that, right? So all this come together. It was quite capital heavy and then operational heavy for the first few years, but now we already figured most part out. The innovation never stops. We're keeping at it. As one of the figure that some of the data I cannot disclose due to confidentiality, but one thing that I'm proud to say, before coronavirus hits, we were already on the edge to be break even or even profitable, even without a pandemic. So if you think about that, the company has been already on the right track to be a sustainable, profitable business. And that is not on the cost to make it too expensive for the user. I know some business does. We never change our vision. We still keep it relatively the most economic viable product and service for the users, but we further improve on the hardware design, increase the durability of the vehicles, and very importantly is to optimizing and reducing our operational cost. So yeah.
Yeah, I mean, you took over in May 2019. I mean, you've had one hell of a first 18 months as the CEO, right? I mean, how have you just personally got through it. Last question, just kind of give us a sense about your own kind of personality and management style. I mean, you wouldn't have expected anything of what all the whole industry has had to go through when you took over in May 2019. So how have you kind of personally got through it?
You mean the COVID-19 part,
Yeah,
or?
just all of that. I mean, like I said,
Yeah.
you wouldn't have taken over in May 2019 knowing that a global pandemic was going to kill lots of people and decimate an entire industry.
I know, yeah, it's a really sad thing that happens in the world, and we all hope that it never happened, right? It's a tough time for sure. And for me, that I see myself more as a builder, and also I'm really good at strategy and products and all that, right? That's where I see myself.
Mm-hmm.
If Lime, depends on how you count it, it's fifth or sixth startup for me. So I know my strengths, I know my weakness, I know what I'm passionate about, right? I'm all passionate about products, I'm all passionate about like the strategy, figure things out. So we start a company without me being the CEO, rather, Toby was the CEO. And we're good partners. He has been in my team for roughly about 4 years before we started the venture together. And that's my strength, is not to run the daily operations, but rather focus on the products and focus on the strategy for the company. I started as a chairman for Lime, and focus my whole energy on the product and service, on the products, and also on figure out the core strategy and make sure that it was true to our vision and to the values. Mm-hmm. And in 2018, the company grew quite fast, and that's a little bit, starting 2019, we already grow from a startup in less than 2 years, right? That we're probably one of the fast ever revenue generating company in the world, in terms of time to launch in the market, and we're probably one of the fast ever global company, from a small market in the US to over 100 markets, 30 countries in less than a year and a half. So that puts a lot of pressure into the company management, organizational wise, culture wise, hirings and political things, everything together. And then Toby and I decided it's better for me to step in while we look for another, CEO that are better for a different stage of the company, and that's why I stepped in. So I've been active 120% online, so it's nothing new to me rather than a title change. I did took on some of the responsibilities that Toby was focusing on, since he is great in terms of sensing the consumers and brandings as well as innovation. So he was repositioned to focus on what he's good at, and well as that I step in to sort out the company for the time roughly about a year. And coronavirus gave us a big hit, and even bigger since we made a decision to shut down like 90+% of the market. Mm-hmm. We know we will lose a ton of the revenue. We know that it will be a tougher restart for us if we did that. But we also know, as a servant to the cities, to our people, we cannot, be the one that help transmit the virus before we figure out a solution. Yeah. So we paused the whole thing for 3-4 months. And then two things happened, bring us back to the market. One is more and more cities come back to us and say, hey, we really need you. You are essential service for us. And think about, you guys are the safest way to get around compared to buses, subways, or any confined transportation that you sit with another one in a confined, environment, including taxi and whatnot, right? And we then started to provide essential services to healthcare providers and to first responders for free. So that's for our first return to that. And the second part really triggers our full return is how we figured we can help to fight that. In addition to that, we've been the safe way to goes around, but also is how we sanitize the vehicles, how we handing little hand sanitizers to the handlebar, and that's the only thing you need to worry about, right? And then education campaigns, all that. So we started back to the market roughly in May. And then, of course, we got a really hit on the revenue side, and we had to do, some of the layoffs in order to sustain the business. Meanwhile, that taking additional fundings as well. Now I handed over the company to Wayne Ting, which was the head of global operation at Lime. He's doing a phenomenal job in terms of running operation, the things I mentioned before, right? Scaling the business, running operations, as well as optimizing our operational cost. And he is the next leader for Lime in terms of running the daily operations. I'm very glad this happens.
Okay.
Now back to my chairman. Back to the beginning.
Okay. And I suspect we could have talked for at least another half an hour or so. There's a bunch of things that I would like to get into, and I'm sure that David would as well. But we try not to go over an hour, and we're probably there or thereabouts. So thank you so much, Brad Bao from Lime. We really appreciate the time you spent with us today. It was a really interesting conversation. Thank you.
Thank you, Kevin. Thank you, David. I really appreciate that you guys create this series. I think the travel industry, there's a long way to go. There's so many things we could do, provide better product services. And also, again, I just wanted to kind of make a call here that anything the entrepreneurs do or investors, please also keep the environmental protection in mind. This is about not just a business or whatnot, revenues and profit, but it's also about how we together to create a better world.
Okay, amen to that. I can't beat that. Only to say, again, thanks ever so much for tuning in. If you're a regular listener, you are a subscriber, I'm sure. But if you're not, you can subscribe to How I Got Here on the usual places. That's iTunes, Spotify, Amazon, Alexa, Google Podcasts, all those places. Give us a review and tell us how brilliant we are. And indeed, tell us how great this interview was, because it was really, really fascinating. So thanks ever so much to Brad again. On behalf of David and I, thank you very much for listening to How I Got Here, and we'll see you next time.
Thanks for listening to the How I Got Here podcast. We'll be back next week with more insight stories behind startups and innovation in travel and transportation. Check mozio.com/move for a complete write-up of the highlights of every podcast with translations into 5 languages, and get your daily dose of news on the digital travel economy by subscribing to the newsletter at PhocusWire.com. See you next week.